This is the virtual lesson for Dr. Pritchard's Anatomy and Physiology 2 lecture that we would be having on Friday, September 20th. Please be sure to review your notes as you go through the lecture. We're going to be finishing up Chapter 16, the somatic sensory pathway, on towards the end of Chapter 16. And then we're going to cover the first couple of types of sensations in the special senses. We're going to cover really briefly the sense of smell and also the sense of taste. We'll pick back up in lecture on Monday with Chapter 17, and we'll begin with the notes on the eye. Thank you. So just to review, the last time we met in class, we were going over the somatic sensory pathways. So remember, there are 3 neurons in a series, starting from the somatic sensory receptor all the way up to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. The second one in the series, the second order neuron, is the one that decussates or crosses over from one side of the nervous system to the other. So for example, your sensations from your right hand will eventually end up in the left side of your brain, in the left primary somatosensory area. All right, so we were looking at an example of these sensations, or of the pathway for these sensations. So when we look at this transfer, we could start with the first order neurons. So if we watch the first order neurons, we come in and go all the way into the spinal cord. All right. So the first order neuron goes all the way into the spinal cord, and then once we go into the spinal cord, we're going to synapse with the second order neuron. So it will synapse with the second order neuron, and it will then cross over. It will synapse with the second order neuron and cross over to the other side, or it could cross over to the other side a little bit later, and then travel all the way up until you come to the thalamus. Then once you get into the thalamus, it will synapse with the third order sensory neuron, and that will go all the way to the primary somatosensory area. So we have our 3 neurons in order, eventually ending at that primary somatosensory area, where you're going to be able to analyze the sensation that was received. So here's the map of the primary somatosensory area. So remember, this is a frontal plane through the postcentral gyrus. So pay attention to the type of cut. Right? So you're actually seeing in this diagram all along that postcentral gyrus. And notice that not all regions of the body receive the same amount of cortex region in your brain. The areas of your body that have the highest concentration of sensory receptors will receive the greatest cortical area, simply because there's more neurons going to those areas. All right, then we began our discussion of the somatic motor pathways with an introduction to the difference between the term upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron. So an upper motor neuron is, well, it's the neurons coming out of the brain, originating in the primary motor areas of the brain. In a direct connection, these neurons originating in this brain area, in the primary motor area of the brain, will go all the way and synapse with the lower motor neurons, and those are the ones that go directly out and activate the skeletal muscles. But there are some indirect circuits that will involve the basal ganglia. We looked at those before when we looked at the brain. They control the smoothness of muscle function and some pre-programmed muscle function. And the cerebellum. The cerebellum is going to make sure that what you want to do with your muscles is what actually is occurring. So it really helps out with coordination. But we'll be looking at that in a little more detail. So those are going to be some indirect processing of those pathways. So when we talk about the organization of the upper motor neurons, we have a direct and indirect pathway. So the direct pathway is exactly what the name says. It goes directly from the cerebral cortex all the way down to the skeletal muscles and directly connects. So there are two primary pathways. One that controls the muscles in the limbs and trunk, and one that controls the muscles in the head. Cortico refers to the cerebral cortex. Spinal refers to the fact that it's coming out of the spinal cord to the limbs, the upper and lower limbs, and the trunk. Bulbar refers to the fact that it comes out in the brain stem. So it connects the cerebral cortex to the brain stem, and that will control muscles associated with the head. Now, this pathway that starts in the cerebral cortex and goes all the way down through the brainstem and potentially all the way down to the spinal cord could have an exit point in the brainstem. So this is going to be the origination for the indirect motor pathway, and this one will involve processing of information through the basal ganglia and also through the cerebellum, and we'll be looking at that in a little more detail. All right. So either way, you initiate control of your skeletal muscles through the primary motor area. So this is the primary somatosensory motor area. It's located in the precentral gyrus. So once again, take a look at the plane, the frontal plane. You can see that this is a cut all along the precentral gyrus. Just like you had uneven distribution of cortical area in the sensory system, you also have more cortical area devoted to muscles of skilled or complicated movements. This is related to the number of motor units. So really we could say that if you have more motor units, and more motor units are usually associated with smaller motor units. More motor units, more cortical area. Now, hopefully you remember what a motor unit is. A motor unit was a motor neuron and all of the skeletal muscle fibers that it connects to. So a small motor unit will have a motor neuron connected to 2, 3, maybe up to 5 motor neurons. I'm sorry, a motor neuron connected to 2, 3, maybe all the way up to 5 muscle cells. Larger motor units would be a single motor neuron connected to maybe 1,000 muscle cells. Right? So usually if you have smaller motor units, you're going to have a lot more of them. That just means more cortical area devoted to that. So where you have highly skilled motions, like you can see your hand has a very large area, and then your mouth, because the production of speech requires incredibly complicated motions associated with your lips and tongues. All right, well, lips and tongue, you only have one tongue, but more fine motion associated with those. Okay, so you'll have more area devoted to them. So here's a little view of some corticospinal pathways. Now there are lots of different tracks that these corticospinal pathways can go through, but you can see that it starts way up here in your cerebral cortex and will go all the way down. The upper motor neuron in this direct pathway will go all the way down. At some point it will also decussate. It crosses over, so you can hear, I'm showing you it crossing over to the other side, and then go all the way down, and then finally at the very end it will synapse. So it will synapse with a lower motor neuron, and this lower motor neuron is what's going to come out of the spinal cord. Right? So that's the combination in a direct pathway of the upper motor neurons. So the upper motor neurons are coming out of the brain, and the lower motor neurons that will go directly to the skeletal muscle. So here's an example of a corticobulbar pathway. So remember, corticobulbar pathways are going to come out of the brain stem. So once again, we have an upper motor neuron. So we have our upper motor neuron coming out, going all the way down until we get to one of the cranial nerves. So in one of the cranial nerves, you'll have the exiting out one of the cranial nerves. For example, in this area, it's the facial nerve. Or it could have gone all the way down and synapse coming out the hypoglossal nerve. The hypoglossal nerve, that controls the activity of your tongue. So these will control movement in the head area, including the movement of your tongue, the movement of your facial muscles, the movement of your lips. All of those are associated with corticobulbar pathways. Then we have the much more complicated indirect pathways. So all the other motor pathways that will help control skeletal muscle will be involved in these indirect pathways. And they're very complicated, and they're polysynaptic. Now, polysynaptic just means there's more than one synapse. If you remember looking at both the corticospinal pathways and the corticobulbar pathways, there is only one synapse between the upper motor neuron and the lower motor neuron. But here in the indirect pathway, we have many synapses, many neurons, and we'll have processing through the basal ganglia to control the smoothness of the motor activity, to make sure that automatic motions are well integrated. It processes through the thalamus. Remember, that's the big distribution point. So a lot of times as we circulate through, it will move back up to the thalamus. The neuron will move back up to the thalamus and they get distributed to the correct area. It will involve the cerebellum for coordination, and then also the reticular formation. The reticular formation we looked at briefly way back when we looked at the brain, and in there I was talking about how it helps you wake up, so it brings in sensory information. But it does bring in sensory information from the entire body. So it's telling you where your body position is. This is going to help out the cerebellum, but we'll look at that more later on. Now, eventually these indirect pathways will go down to the lower motor neurons, but they will descend in the spinal cord as some major tracts. And here you can see a representation of these major tracts. I'm not going to require that you remember the names of all of these indirect pathway tracts. I'm more interested that you remember the name of the direct pathway tracts, the corticospinal or the corticobulbar. But you should know that there are some major tracts where the indirect pathway will go down eventually, and eventually will control the lower motor neurons. So both pathways, the direct and the indirect pathways, eventually synapse with the lower motor neurons. So one good way to view this is by looking at a flow chart of the connection between the upper motor neurons, between the motor areas of the brain, and eventually connecting all the way down to the skeletal muscles. Okay, so first let's just look at the upper motor neurons in a direct pathway going all the way down to the lower motor neurons. So we have coming directly here out of the motor cortex, we have the upper motor neurons directly going all the way down. Now remember, some of them will synapse down in the brainstem, but many of them will synapse in the spinal cord, going eventually all the way down and connecting to the lower motor neurons that directly connect to the skeletal muscles. Right? The indirect pathways, what you may notice is in the indirect pathways, some of those arrows circulate back up. So those are over on the other side, shown in red, and they will process information down. So you may get some information going directly from the motor cortex down to the basal ganglia, which will help process the information. The basal ganglia will send its commands down to the brainstem, and Then there'll be some pathways that will come from that could begin to control the lower motor neurons. Or you might get some sensory information coming in from the reticular formation that will move up and inform the cerebellum of how your body is doing. And the cerebellum may make some corrective signals, so it'll distribute that information to the thalamus, that big distribution area, going back up so your brain can make some corrections. So you can see that the indirect pathway can become fairly common, but notice all of these end eventually in this lower motor neuron. So sometimes that's called the final common pathway. You can see that word on there. That's the final common pathway. So you sum together all of the signals coming from the direct pathway, all the signals coming from the indirect pathway, and that will tell the skeletal muscles in the end exactly what they should do. So you sum all of those signals together in the lower motor neurons, and they directly control the skeletal muscles. All right, let's talk a little bit about something you don't want to happen, known as paralysis. Paralysis is simply when the skeletal muscle does not operate correctly, or there's some impairment, some inability to correctly move skeletal muscle. And there's two different forms of paralysis. There is flaccid paralysis and spastic paralysis. So oftentimes when people think of paralysis, they think of flaccid paralysis. And the term flaccid just means limp, no activity. In flaccid paralysis, there is some injury that damaged the lower motor neurons. So you do not have that connection directly to the skeletal muscles, telling the skeletal muscle to do anything. So if some injury occurred on the right side of the body, it's going to be the right skeletal muscles that show the paralysis. You see no reflex action. The muscles are limp, they're flaccid, there's very little muscle tone. The muscles simply are limp, they're not working. Now, almost directly opposite to that is spastic paralysis. And spastic paralysis involves damage to the upper motor neurons. So this might be associated with a head injury. Remember, you cross over to the other side of the body. So if you had injury to the right side of your brain, you might see some paralysis on the left side of the body, on the opposite side from the injury. So in this case, you still have lower motor neurons that are innervating the skeletal muscle, and they're sitting there just waiting for information to come to them, for a nervous impulse to come to them from those upper motor neurons, and they're not receiving it. They often will interpret that, those lower motor neurons may interpret that as a constant signal. So you might get a dramatically increased muscle tone and really exaggerated reflexes. The problem is spastic paralysis can become very painful very quickly. So just do a little experiment with spastic paralysis. What I want you to do is to take maybe just your hand. Your forearm muscles will control your hand, and try and contract every muscle, every single muscle in your forearm, and see what begins to happen to your hand. You'll notice that your fingers may begin to curl into a little claw, and just keep that contracted as long as you can, and you'll probably notice that pretty soon it starts becoming painful. So this is what a person with spastic paralysis may experience all of the time. This is one of the benefits of, we've talked about it before, botulinum toxin. Now, botulinum toxin has the ability to block the release of neurotransmitter from the motor neurons that directly attach to the muscles. So they block the release of acetylcholine, that's the neurotransmitter that affects skeletal muscle. So if you do that, you can actually relieve some of the problem with spastic paralysis. All right, so let's look a little more at what the cerebellum does in relation to this indirect pathway and some of the functions of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum will bring together some motor signals coming down from the cerebral cortex with sensory information coming up from the body through that reticular formation. And it will monitor, therefore, the intent for movement, what your brain wants the movement to be, with the actual movement, and that's going to be from the sensory information coming up. So we'll compare those two, and if necessary, if it sees that the body isn't acting correctly, it will send out some sort of corrective feedback. So let's look at the processing through the cerebellum. All right, so we begin with number 1 here, and that's going to be the command that's coming down from the upper motor neuron. All right, so in red, if you look up at the motor areas of the cerebral cortex in red, it's sending its command signal down, and it will go all the way down and connect to the lower motor neurons, but there's a little bypass that occurs right in the brainstem region, right around the area of the pons. And that little bypass, that red bypass indicated by 1, will go to the cerebellum, and the cerebellum will begin to analyze what the intention for movement was. But at the same time, in blue, you can see the blue, those are the sensory signals from proprioceptors in muscles, joints, vestibular apparatus, eyes. So it's giving you sensory information about what the body is actually doing. So that's also coming in to the cerebellum. So from number 1, the intention for movement, what your body intended you to do, and in number 2, what is actually happening, the sensory information. Then you'll have the processing. Both of that will come together. The cerebellum will compare intended versus actual, and if needed, it can send corrective feedback out. Right? So it'll send corrective feedback all the way back up to the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, and then you'll begin the process again. Now, it took me a long time to work my way through those 4 steps of how the cerebellum is helping to make sure your actions, your muscle movement is correct, but this in reality takes milliseconds, and it's constantly occurring. You're constantly making slight errors with muscle movement, but your cerebellum is very quickly changing that up and making sure that everything's occurring correctly. All right. So at the very beginning of this chapter, I said that I was going to talk about some sensation, some sensory pathways, some motor pathways, but also going to really briefly mention some integrative functions of the cerebrum, how this controls some higher level processing, higher level thought formation. Now, I am not a neuroscientist. If you are really interested in this area of the brain, then I would recommend that you go and talk to some of the scientists over in the psychology department. Many of them are neuroscientists, and this is specifically what they study. The simplicity of the neuron in terms of how you get an action potential, and we've gone over that in a lot of detail, but combine that together with how you put all of that activity together and you get your ability to move from sleep to wake. How do you process dreams while you're asleep? How does your body heal itself while you're asleep? How do you learn? Learning and memory. Now remember, I have a couple of videos on the home screen of our e-learning page from a neuroscientist in Birmingham, Alabama, talking about how you learn best, or how most people learn best. And I recommend that you listen to those or watch those before you take a test, because it might help you figure out how to learn, how to move this learning into memory. And also emotional responses. How do we have all of this sensory information and it actually produce some sort of an emotion associated with the various sensations? All right, so first, how do we wake up? The reticular activating system associated with this reticular formation. So this is this area on our figure. This is the area associated mainly with the brain stem. So if we look at this brain stem region right here, right there, you can see that it contains the reticular activating system. So axons from this go up through the reticular formation. This carries some baseline sensory information, and it will go up through the thalamus up to the cerebral cortex, and you can see that it's widely distributed. The final points to the cerebral cortex are very widely distributed, covers a large area. So this will generally increase the activity of the entire cerebral cortex, and that should cause awakening from sleep. So sleep is a temporary time of little conscious activity from which you can be easily aroused. So you're brought out of sleep into conscious awareness of the world around you. So what is sleep? Sleep is actually a state of altered consciousness. You are changing slightly how your brain processes information. In some components of sleep, your mental processing activity is a little bit reduced, and that will actually allow your autonomic nervous system to take over and is pretty important for healing and regeneration of the body. But then it'll be interspersed with areas called REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, where you will actually have very high upper level brain activity, that's going to be associated with dreaming. So we have our two main components to sleep, our non-rapid eye movement sleep and our rapid eye movement sleep, named of course after how rapidly the eye moves. Now in non-rapid eye movement sleep, you may see some gradual eye rolls from one side to the other of the head. So it's not that the eyes aren't moving at all, it's just very slow. In rapid eye movement sleep, the eyes are moving fairly quickly. All right, so stage 1 of sleep is really a transition zone between wakefulness and sleep. I see a lot of students in stage 1 of sleep. You may be in stage 1. Wake up if you're in stage 1 of sleep right now. So this is your transition zone. A lot of times you say, I'm just closing my eyes for a minute, but really you're about to fall asleep. All right, then you'll move from stage 1 into stage 2. Now, let me pause for a second. If you look back up at stage 1 in the blue area, the top blue area, you'll notice that the lines of your EEG, so what we're looking at here is an EEG, monitoring brainwave activity. You'll notice that stage 1 looks a lot like being awake, the alpha waves of being awake but your eyes closed and relaxed, but you'll notice that the frequency is slightly less, so there's a little less activity. Then as you begin to move into stage 2 and then down into stage 3, you begin to see those waves in stage 2 to 3, you'll begin to see those waves begin to get deeper. All right, so the amplitude, the deepness of the wave begins to increase, and as you move in through stage 3, you may begin to see these very large spikes. They're called sleep spindles. Okay. All right, then we move on into stage 4 of sleep. This is slow wave sleep. So the frequency, the distance between the waves is very far apart. You see these very deep delta waves. This is the time where conscious control over skeletal muscle activity is at its lowest level, and really your autonomic nervous system should be dominating and should be helping your body repair itself. Now there are some strange things that can happen during stage 4 of sleep. For example, bedwetting is most likely to occur during stage 4 of sleep. remember, conscious control over skeletal muscle is reduced. You have conscious control over elimination of urine through your urethra. At first, it's a reflex response, elimination of the urine, but you have conscious control over some skeletal muscle that will allow you to put off urination. So if you go to bed with a very full bladder and you go immediately into stage 4 sleep and can't be easily brought out of sleep, then there might be the experience of some bedwetting. Often children may experience bedwetting because they have fairly small bladders that fill up very quickly, and young children will spend proportionately more time in stage 4, having to do with how fast their bodies are growing. They need to have more energy renewal time periods down in stage 4 of sleep. Something else unusual that often occurs during stage 4 of sleep is sleepwalking. So as you remove conscious control over skeletal muscle activity, sometimes you have some pre-programmed skeletal muscle activity. So people may get up, walk around, move from one place to another. Some people even experience things called sleep eating. Or in a really bad example, they may experience something called sleep driving. Have you ever driven somewhere when you're really groggy first thing in the morning, and before you know it, you're there? You've done it so many times, it's a pre-programmed activity, and this pre-programmed activity could occur during stage 4 sleep. All right. Then we have rapid eye movement sleep. Rapid eye movement sleep is where you have the highest brain activity. So this is going to be, once again, if you look and compare this to stage 1 and all the way up to the alpha waves, you can see that the waveform begins to look a lot more like those. So you have high brain activity. This is where you will dream, where you will process problems or information from the day. And it's really important for good mental health that a person spend a certain period of time within REM sleep. Now, throughout the night, when you first begin to fall asleep, you'll go through stage 1 to stage 2, 3, 4, and then you'll come back up from 4 to 3 to 2 and go into REM sleep. And you'll continue to have these sleep cycles throughout the night until hopefully you have accumulated a significant amount of time within REM sleep. Learning and memory. Really, this is a really important concept for students. Learning is simply the ability to acquire new information or skills through instruction, like I'm doing right now, or through experience, having done something. But the trick is to convert that learning process into memory. So information is stored, the learning is stored, and you have the ability to easily retrieve that information. And that's the trick. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide about some different types of memory. Now, the good thing is, even though your brain has very poor ability to grow new neurons, the neurons that do exist are very plastic. So by saying plastic, we just mean moldable or changeable. So because they are plastic, you can have real physical structural changes in the neurons, so they can get some new connections with other neurons as you begin to learn, and also begin to get some functional changes. Your neurons, as you begin to use that bit of information that you're trying to store in your memory, as you continue to use it, you will release more neurotransmitters, and there's actually a positive feedback spiral that will begin to exist between a couple of neurons where you release some neurotransmitter, and it will actually make the receiving neuron better at processing the information. So you'll have a positive feedback between neurons as you continue to convert learning into memory. So there are a lot of different memory types. When you're getting ready for an exam, what you don't want to depend on is that immediate memory. All right? Immediate memory is just recall for a few seconds. And after those seconds are gone, you've lost that. Short-term memory is more of a temporary ability to recall information. So you pull that information into some of the neurons. And if you remember from last semester, we talked a little bit about neural circuits. So these are going to be a type of neural circuit known as a reverberating circuit. And in a reverberating circuit, you have a little bit of an input, and then the neurons will connect, but eventually they could circle back on each other. So you'll have this constant circular processing and occasionally a little bit of an output, right? So this is short-term memory. So you put it into these neural circuits and you spin it around. This is where you're walking into class and you're trying to repeat one bit of information over and over again. The problem is if it's just in one of these pre-existing reverberating circuits, the minute something new comes in, you'll lose the ability to store the old, unless you have over a very long period of time kept using this information. And this is where you can move from short-term memory into long-term memory. So sometimes these connections between neurons in the reverberating circuit may become permanent, all right? And that's what you want. And this is the example of where release of some neurotransmitter will actually induce the postsynaptic neuron to become more sensitive to that neurotransmitter. So it will begin to solidify the connection between the presynaptic neuron, solidify the connection between that and the postsynaptic. And when you begin to solidify that connection, then you really move into your long-term memory, which is much more important. So this process of frequently reinforcing that memory by constantly using it and converting from short-term memory into a longer-term memory is known as memory consolidation. And that's what you want to do before you go to an exam. All right, so that's going to do it for Chapter 16. We're going to go on and get into Chapter 17 for just a few slides. Let me pause and switch over. All right, now we're going to start Chapter 17, the special senses. So the special senses are a little bit different than the general senses, and we've already talked about some of the differences between the general senses and the special senses, but just let's review them in two little columns. So your general senses included your somatic sensations. So that was stuff like the sense of touch or tactile, temperature, thermal, pain, proprioception, and all of those visceral sensations. So they're scattered throughout the body. They're not focused in one specific area. And the sensory receptors are fairly simple. So you have maybe just a free nerve ending, or maybe the nerve endings are only covered by a few layers of connective tissue, right? As opposed to the special senses. So these are the ones that are going to be concentrated in the head: smelling, tasting, vision, hearing, equilibrium. And they are made up of really complicated anatomical structures, like your nasal cavities are fairly complicated. Your eyeball is a very complicated anatomical structure. So your sensory receptors for your eyes are located as a small portion of the eyeball, but those anatomical structures help enhance how well you use those senses. So these are going to be senses that we often depend on extremely much for decision makings, and often there's some complicated neural pathways interior to figuring out how you interpret these special senses. All right, so we're going to just be going today through the chemical senses, and one of the chemical senses includes the sense of smell. And by chemical sense, I mean that you have a chemical that attaches to the sensory receptor. So you're going to be opening up when you initiate the stimulus to the neuron. It will be a, let me turn on my ink. It will be a ligand gated channel, right? Again, this is where ANP1 may come back to haunt you, a ligand gated channel. So that's simply where a chemical, a molecule, attaches to the receptor and it opens up a gate, allows ions to flow across the membrane, and from that you will get a change to the signal. You will get a graded potential change. Now here in olfaction, you're going to get a generator potential because the olfactory receptors are the first order sensory neurons. They are the sensory neurons. Okay, so where are these sensory neurons located? They're located in the olfactory epithelium, and the olfactory epithelium is found in the superior portion right there of the nasal cavity. So up at the top of your nasal cavity. That's not where your external nose is, but interior to that. And it's just below the brain, so just below the frontal lobe of the brain. All right. Laying directly on top of it is the olfactory bulb. The first, remember, that's going to be your first cranial nerve. You have one nose, that's cranial nerve number 1. Okay. So these neurons will penetrate through the bones that cover the opening to the nasal cavity, so they'll penetrate down and they'll go down into the nasal epithelium. Okay. These neurons are bipolar neurons. So if you recall, a bipolar neuron is where you have the neural cell body with the nucleus, the neural cell body, and then you have one primary dendrite and one primary axon, right? So the dendrites are going to go all the way down into the olfactory epithelium, and the axons will go up and synapse with neurons in the olfactory bulb and become part of the olfactory cranial nerve. So the olfactory receptors are going to respond to an odorant molecule. So when you smell something, molecules of whatever is causing that smell literally get into your body, get into your nasal cavity, and attach to these olfactory receptors. Think about that the next time you smell fecal material. Wait, process that? Yes. The fecal material, little bits of it, actually have penetrated all the way into your nasal cavity and are triggering that sense of smell. All right, so it responds to the odorant molecule. There's other things that are found in that olfactory epithelium. There's also some supporting cells that are found in the olfactory epithelia. So they provide some support. They structurally hold things in place. They also will release a lot of mucus. So here you can see mucus. These chemicals have to be dissolved in a solution before they can affect the odorant receptor, before they can affect the olfactory receptor. There's also some basal cells. Now, basal cells are stem cells that will replace olfactory receptors. So this is actually an area of the body where you can replace neurons. So you are growing new neurons in your olfactory epithelium. All right, and then we have our taste buds, right, and the taste papillae. So the taste buds and the taste papillae The papillae are little projections that go deep into the tongue, and the taste buds are going to be found associated with those lingual papillae. So taste buds are a little bit like the olfactory epithelium. Once again, it's a chemical sense, but you have small little areas of the receptor cells, the supporting cells, and the basal cells, and they sink down below the surface of the tongue, below even the surface of the lingual papillae. So if we look at this figure right here, right, you can see the surface is up at the top, and then the taste bud is sunk all the way down below that. And then let's look at where the taste bud is located along the side of one of those lingual papillae. So this sort of reddish area right here, I'm drawing in, that's the actual surface of the tongue, and then the taste bud is going to be found on the sides of the papillae, which is sunk down below the surface of the tongue. This should tell you your body's trying to protect these taste buds from wear and tear. You know, if you were chewing, if you drank something that was incredibly hot, you could burn the surface of your tongue, but hopefully you're not going to damage the taste buds if you damage the surface of the tongue. You'll keep them around. Now, these gustatory receptor cells are special receptor cells. They are not the sensory neuron. So they are going to synapse with this sensory neuron. So this is going to create a receptor potential. Okay? There are many gustatory cells per taste bud, as well as some supporting cells and the basal cells that will help replace them. They're sunk down below the surface of the tongue, and they will send out a little hair from their taste pore that has the ability to attach the chemical, the molecule, that will trigger the sense. So once again, these are going to be chemical senses. Ligand-gated channels will open up and allow the sensation to occur. Okay. I wouldn't worry about the types of papillae, and I've noticed that my screenshot has cut off some of the 5 types of taste. So you can see that there is sour. So we have sour is one of the 5 types of taste. And there is also sweet. There is also bitter. Salty. And then one that sort of new, some people don't know about, is called umami. Now umami is something called a savory sense. It actually detects amino acids. So meats would really trigger umami, and that's UMAMI is umami. Now sometimes you'll see people develop a taste map of the tongue. So they may say, well, right here on the tip of the tongue, that's going to be sweet. And then on either side of sweet, we have salty. And then way on the sides, we have sour. And then bitter is going to be, bitter will be back in the very edge. And umami is usually considered to be scattered all over the surface, but that's not exactly correct. They are clustered a bit in these areas, but you do have a scattering of all different types of taste buds across the tongue. But each individual taste bud will only be responsible for tasting one of these types of taste. So you have all the receptor cells in one taste bud would be keyed into sour. All the receptor cells in a different taste bud might be keyed into sweet. So there are these 5. They are clustered in areas of the tongue, but in reality they're scattered enough. And not only just on your tongue, you have some taste buds on your soft palate, You have some taste buds that are found all the way back in the tube in back of your oral cavity called your oropharynx. So they are scattered throughout your mouth, concentrated on your tongue, and they will be somewhat concentrated into some different zones. But I wouldn't pay too much attention to the zones, but you should know the different sensations, the different types of taste. All right, so this is going to do it for today, because the next slide is going to begin with the sense of vision or sight. So we'll be starting this up on Monday when we meet again. All right, have a good day.